Learning about security doesn't need to be scary.
If you want to ship code securely with confidence, check out the URL below and challenge yourself with thousands of challenges in 29 coding frameworks. Let the games begin.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to AppSec Day. I'd like to welcome our next speaker, Michael from AssetNote, who's going to talk to us about ephemeral vulnerabilities and the case for continuous security. So welcome, Michael.
Thank you. So a little bit about me. I'm the CEO of AssetNote. Prior to that, I ran the Spider Labs team in Asia Pac. I presented a bunch at other conferences, mostly on mobile security, so a little bit different. And if you're in Brisbane, I run Sec Talks with a bunch of others, and TusCon, which is the best conference in Australia. Yeah, this is second best, just going to say. I usually present this with my co-founder, Shubs. He's unfortunately unable to make it today. He's not feeling too well. He's the CTO of AssetNote. He was formerly at Bishop Fox. He's a really good bug hunter. He's in the HackerOne top 50. He couldn't be here today, unfortunately. But some of this is his stuff. So I wanted to acknowledge him, and then also hopefully I don't screw it up, his parts, but we'll see how we go. All right, so what are ephemeral vulnerabilities? So quite simply, they're just vulnerabilities that exist in an application or system for a short period of time, usually a matter of hours or days. So, I mean, that's pretty straightforward, right? Pretty simple, but there's a lot more to ephemeral vulnerabilities, which we'll demonstrate. So, as I said, it seems straightforward, but like, why do they exist? Why is this a problem? How common are they? What is the impact? Essentially, is this a real thing, or are we just kind of trying to come up with some sort of fancy name and sound smart? So let's dive into it. So the key drivers of ephemeral vulnerabilities, right? It's not necessarily a unique or new idea. Like, any bug can be ephemeral. But ephemeral vulnerabilities, at least in our experience, are becoming a lot more prevalent. And while you can't really pinpoint a single root cause, based on our experience looking, for these sorts of bugs across a number of different programs, as well as other organizations, there are definitely some common elements that seem to be at play in terms of driving the increased prevalence of these sorts of issues. So at the end of the day, right, any vulnerability is just a reflection of the current development practices and technologies. So if we look at sort of recent trends, what are we sort of seeing in this space? Like, we're seeing cloud-first architecture, far more agile and reactive sort of development practices, DevOps, continuous deployment, quick deployment. We're seeing, a rise in all of these, and there's been a bunch of great talks today around these elements and making sure that you keep secure. But what this is really leading to, and what the sort of these drivers are kind of creating in terms of an outcome, are larger and more fluid attack surfaces. A blurring of the line between what's considered a development machine or a development environment and production environment, and how they're sort of starting to merge a little bit more, and then just a real rapid pace of change and development. So, obviously, when you take these sort of outcomes, it creates a lot of challenges in terms of securing, these sorts of architectures, and traditional approaches, which are very sort of point in time, have failed to sort of adapt, and they're not really keeping up, with this more modern environment. And then particularly in larger organizations that, often will have somewhat complicated internal structures, multiple subsidiaries, different teams, different kind of reporting structures and all that kind of stuff. It can, exacerbate these sorts of issues. And, we really feel like these are some of the key drivers in what's leading to seeing more ephemeral and high impact, ephemeral vulnerabilities. So, we're hackers, so we like to, show stuff with examples. So we have a few examples of ephemeral vulnerabilities. So, we at AssetNote, sorry, a little bit of a plug, we perform continuous security monitoring for a number of large companies, and we're also very active in the bounty space. So this is drawn from these experiences and what we're seeing, and looking at these companies on scale, these are just some examples of sort of the things that we commonly see. So example one, the afternoon drinks on Friday bugs. So this is actually a surprisingly common pattern that we see. We knock off on Friday, we go for some beers. It's a little bit early, your boss has left maybe for the day, so you knock off. And what we've found, in organizations that we're looking at, this can actually lead to a pattern in terms of bugs. And we normally find out sort of Friday night, Saturday morning about these bugs. Because what's kind of happening is, developers will spin something up, maybe start something, not finish it, knock off. I'll pick it up on Monday. But depending on what they're doing, there's often bugs that kind of show up and then disappear once, the early next week, right? So we call them the knocking off on Friday bugs. So this is a particular example so again, and this sort of comes to the idea of why you want to continuously monitor it. So we're monitoring this asset, and it was behind, this login page, right? So behind one login, and it's been like that since we started monitoring it. And it was doing everything correctly. There were no issues with it. It was enforcing the authentication correctly. But then one day, it changed. And now it looked like this. And it actually was an admin panel, internal only, containing production data for a lot of really sensitive stuff. And that seems really simple, right? But we see this all the time, right? Either it's a mistake, somebody makes a change, maybe they're working on something and they take it, away from being behind SSO. Sometimes we see this a lot with things like GitLab signups. So we'll see GitLab signups being open on the internet for a short period of time because, maybe they've got a new developer starting. They don't want to have to deal with all the issues. They open it up to the internet and then they take it down. So we see this stuff all the time. Now, we only found this because we were continuously monitoring this target. We were looking at it every single hour, in fact, and that's when we can pick up these changes. If we're looking at it even on a week-to-week basis, we probably would have missed this. So again, pretty critical bug. Simple, ephemeral, but also very impactful. Example 2, keys to the kingdom. So a lot of modern front-end stacks are, incredibly complex. Any developers in the room will tell you that. It's a pain for us as well. It's, it's a challenge. But, what we're seeing is that these front-end applications are often packaged using Webpack, and most front-end frameworks will include that in their toolchain. Within the last year, we've discovered 2 instances where developers have accidentally bundled production secrets within the front-end code, which we can see. So, obviously, production secrets should never be in client-side code, but this sort of stuff happens. A lot of one of the reasons I really love this conference is it's very friendly when it comes to developers. Like a lot of security conferences historically have been, oh, we're smarter than you, or like you guys have screwed up, or whatever, and it's kind of nuts. And I really hate that because when you're managing an application or a system, particularly if you're doing it at any kind of scale, these sorts of things happen. It's hard, right? It's hard to stay on top of this sort of stuff. And so, these sort of slip-ups happen. It's not nobody intends to do this sort of stuff. It's usually a mistake. But, if you're not looking at this and you're not trying to pick this up quickly, then you're going to miss these sorts of things. So yeah, here's an example, and here's a sort of summary of it. Basically, we found within the main JavaScript bundle, there was a secrets.json, and in that there were credentials for CloudFront, and pretty straightforward, right? The interesting thing about there we go. Here's an example. So again, we were looking at this asset, and this wasn't bundling it in for. I think it was at least sort of 4 or 5 months that we were monitoring it. There were no issues with this asset. And then one day, somebody's obviously pushed an update or whatever, included these production secrets, and now it's there, right? So again, looking at things continuously, you can not only identify some of these things, particularly the ones that are ephemeral, but also remediate things quickly, right? So the interesting thing about that was we played around with it. We weren't really sure exactly what we could do with it, but we submitted it. And this is the sort of interesting thing. They awarded a 9.5K bounty for this. And Shubs, this is Shubs' bug. He was like, that's really great. Thank you for the bounty. But, why was the impact so high? Why did you give us this much money? And it turns out that with some certain, if we had a bit more time and we started to dive into it a little bit more, knew maybe a little bit more about how things were architected at that company, we would have had access to incredibly sensitive data, specifically, their customer data. And yeah, it was a pretty impactful bug for them. Again, these sorts of things, simple mistake, often for a short period of time, but usually pretty impactful. And then another one, example 3, another keys to the kingdom. And this is a really good example, and it kind of really stresses the kind of approach of looking at things continuously. So this is a Git repository on Slack leading to source code and secrets. We also have, the others have been obfuscated, but Slack has given us permission to talk about this bug. So we're monitoring assets owned by Slack. We found a number of domains that belong to Slack, Slack-reader, Slack-files, and Slack-core. And with that, there were thousands of subdomains that were found underneath all these domains. Literally, thousands of assets on the internet. Again, very large attack surface, constantly being developed and updated, very fluid. And yeah, then we monitor those for bugs. And then for a short period of time, there was a Git repository that was exposed containing the source code for Slack's web application, so all the backend source code. So basically, there were these subdomains QA20 to QA30 under those domains that I mentioned earlier, and each one of them had this Git repository in the web root. But the interesting thing about this issue was it was ephemeral in nature, right? So it was exposing this for a short period of time. I think it was a few hours at a time. And so we were able to pick it up because we were checking and monitoring every single hour for this. And so I think as well, I can't confirm this. This is sort of my suspicion is that it was likely something to do with like a deployment process, right? Something that's automated, probably something that's kind of set and forget a little bit. As they were deploying these staging boxes, it was exposing this, and that's why they were ephemeral, because once the staging box wasn't needed anymore, it was like spun down, and that's why it was coming back. So basically we cloned the Git repository, which we do automatically, and in the config PHP, it had 300 hard-coded credentials. So Zendesk, Salesforce, literally keys to the kingdom. It took Slack. I really don't envy the guy who had to go and rotate all those creds, but I think there was a couple that took them almost a year to be able to fully rotate. Just because of their architecture and the complexity and stuff. But they're really good to deal with. They were gracious enough to let us talk about this, and they fixed it obviously. But again, a good example of if we weren't looking continuously, if we didn't know those assets, we wouldn't have been able to see it. And so if you contrast it with traditional approaches to finding these sorts of bugs that are very point in time, that are very static, they're not keeping up with the pace of change. Right? They're not able to find these sorts of ephemeral issues unless you get incredibly lucky and lightning strikes, right? So this sort of leads into my next part, right? Which is what are some of the strategies and techniques that you guys can employ to sort of mitigate these vulnerabilities? The most companies will lack visibility into these issues, particularly large companies. And even if they have a well-funded security team, it's actually pretty hard to, most companies don't understand or have sort of the frame of reference to start, finding these issues. Because, traditional thinking is really not really adapted to the sort of the pace of change, right? So, typically what you'll do is, you'll have your list of assets that at a point in time, you'll throw them to a vulnerability scanner, you'll throw them to a pen test at a point in time, and then 3 months later, rinse and repeat, right? So they're not really keeping up. And so to summarize in terms of what are the sort of key improvements that we recommend organizations can sort of make, the first is improving the asset awareness, right? So if you're not looking at it, you're not going to be able to find these sort of bugs. And then really shift to more of a continuous assessment and monitoring model and mindset, like really moving away from this sort of point in time view of identifying bugs or process to identify bugs, and then focus on impact, which I'll discuss a little bit more as well. So in terms of improving assets awareness, right? I'm not the first to say this. I won't be the last. You can't protect what you don't know is there, right? Most organizations really struggle with this and really understanding the fuller scope of their attack surface, right? Modern development practices, as much as they're great, have also exacerbated this issue, right? Being able to, really spin up new assets very quickly, develop very quickly, and also even something as simple as, I can, as a developer, I can just spin up some boxes on AWS with my credit card in my division, totally bypassing any other processes that you have, right? And so these sort of really large and really fluid attack surfaces, really result in struggling to keep visibility of what you've even got, and especially what you're exposing to the internet. I ask a lot of companies, how many AWS accounts they have, and usually the answer is wrong, right? Because it's, as I said, it's very easy to get set up. And so what are some of the strategies that you can employ to improve your asset awareness? So the first one is automate, right? Particularly if you're working on a large scale, you won't keep up with the pace unless you work on some kind of automation, right? A point-in-time list of assets that's out of date in a week isn't going to be useful, particularly when it comes to trying to find and identify and deal with ephemeral vulnerabilities. Don't rely on what you're being told you have, right? So focus on aggregating asset data from technical sources, because a lot of what counts for sort of asset management in companies these days is, they'll get, stuff from the development team, or they'll get stuff from various teams, like give us a list of assets. You get an Excel spreadsheet and that's it, right? So don't rely on that sort of stuff. Go from truer, sort of more technical sources. So if you're using AWS and Route 53, that's really good. Cert transparency, DNS, Active Directory, things like that. Focus on, with your automation, aggregating from these data sources and creating a sort of a real-time inventory that's updating from those sources. Take an outside-in approach. This is a bit more subjective, I guess, but, I would start, if you're looking at, going from zero to, to something, start from the outside in, right? A good start is to really focus on what's externally accessible, and then work in from there. So, most organizations would be surprised, I feel, with what's exposed to the internet, at least in my experience. We often get, when we submit a bug, or even with our customers, right, they sort of say, I didn't know we had that out there. I had no idea, right? And I don't blame them, but, it's probably a good place to start. And kind of move beyond IP-based thinking, right? This is an AppSec conference, right? But a lot of the traditional approaches to discovering and finding assets have been based on IPs, right? And that might make sense when back in the day, everything was in a single data center, and if you had a range, every asset that you owned would be underneath that. That's not the case nowadays, right? So really try and focus on understanding your application assets and the attack surface that's associated with that as well. And then seek context as well. So having just a list of assets is great, and it's a good start if you don't already have that, and it's, if you can get that and it's up to, that's great. But then the next kind of step is, providing contextual information around that. What sort of technologies, what stack is this particular application running? What versions, what languages is it written in? Having that context will help you for, targeting your approaches to finding issues, but also even just outside of, ephemeral vulnerabilities, having that information is really useful. There's a new bug in PHP. What's everything that we got that's running PHP, right? So having that context can be really helpful, even, beyond identifying ephemeral issues. So adopting a continuous assessment mindset. So traditional thinking when it comes to vulnerability identification is really point in time, right? As I said before, the typical process is you run a vuln scan or, some sort of pen test or some sort of assessment, you get a list of vulnerabilities, you remediate and fix the issues, and then rinse, repeat, 6 months later, a year later, whatever. And what's happening in that time is, your attack surface is really fluid and evolving. And so this approach really fails to keep up. And particularly these sort of ephemeral vulnerabilities that are very short-lived, you're not going to find those bugs, and you are exposed, you're not getting visibility into that exposure. And so depending on your attack surface as well and the size of your attack surface, and this is my opinion, but once a month is even not continuous enough, right? Focus on at least daily or even more ideally hourly vulnerability discovery. So here's a handy diagram that I prepared earlier. So here's a vulnerability assessment. Here's another one, a little bit later. Here's another one. And then you got your pen test here. Yeah, there you go. Pen test there. And this is where the ephemeral vulnerabilities live, right? So you're missing that, right? And you're missing what's happening in between. So there you go. Handy illustration for the visual folks in the room. Focus on impact. So it's really important that when you're trying to build these sort of systems and you're trying to build these approaches, that you focus on impact, right? And there's a number of key reasons for that, right? So what you're doing is you're taking something that's really static, really small point in time, and now you're scaling it out. Now it's like, okay, you've built some automation to track your assets from all these sort of technical sources. You've got that there, that's great. And then now you're sort of starting to focus on, I want to continuously look for issues in that attack surface, on a regular basis. Now you're scaling everything up. So one of the things you need to do to keep sane is focus on impact. So the first reason for focusing on impact is the reduction of overhead, right? Don't bite off more than you can chew. Focusing on too much at once increases the overhead, and shifting to a continuous approach, you really need to have high signal, right? Otherwise, you're just going to be drowning in notifications from whatever you're looking for and set up, right? So don't think if you're going to sort of build some sort of approach where it's like, I'm continuously looking at this sort of stuff, don't focus on trying to put everything in there. Otherwise, you'll just get a whole bunch of stuff back that you can't deal with. And in a lot of cases, it's probably not important. So really focus on impact. Scalability as well. Like, you're not going to handle scale. So, most companies, there's obviously everybody sort of varies in size, but any sort of medium-sized, particularly tech-based company will have potentially, at the very least 500 assets out on the internet, potentially thousands or tens of thousands. And so, if you're looking for issues, and particularly sorts of ephemeral issues across that scale, you're not going to handle that if you want to look for 10,000 different things that don't matter, right? Focus on what's important to you guys. Focus on, where the risks are for you. And agility, right? So one of the great things about taking this approach and with these ephemeral vulnerabilities is you can find them quickly, so you can react to them quickly and really limit the exposure. And so focusing on impact means you can be more agile in reacting to that. So you're not dealing with a whole bunch of other stuff that doesn't matter. So yeah, that's it. Quick talk. Questions? Yep. Okay, down the front.
I noticed you kind of mentioned you were using your tool, at least in bug bounty scenario. Right? So I kind of have two thoughts on that. One, have you found that companies respond well to that, for one, because you're technically monitoring their infrastructure permanently, and they go, well, it's gone now, so I don't care. And they're actually polite about it. And two, do you ever, have you noticed this, or are you concerned about other people doing the same thing because they can, or they might be able to, and then not doing the responsible disclosure and then being nefarious around it? So if you hadn't picked up on that Slack bug, someone else has just popped 400 keys, and you're like, have fun.
Yeah. So the first part of your question around automating this. So the focus of the talk for me was more around how you can use these sort of techniques defensively, right? And how you can sort of get that visibility and manage that. But we use bounties as a test bed for our system to test scalabilities and stuff like that. And so we've never had a problem with that. Usually, people, you put anything on the internet, it's getting scanned anyway, right? You're naive if you don't know that, right? So it's getting scanned constantly. But we haven't had any issues with companies that have had issues with finding these sorts of bugs from doing this continuous scanning. They're usually pretty happy to see them. In terms of do we get sort of that kind of response of, oh, well, it's gone now. It was up for a short period of time, whatever. It depends. We usually wouldn't, from a bug bounty perspective at least, we usually wouldn't submit something that, probably didn't have an impact in that sort of short window. But so something like, leaking credentials, it's actually really important to understand that from a defensive perspective. So was it up for 4 hours? Was it up for 6 hours? Was it up for 2 days? If it was up for 1 hour, right, we spotted it because we're doing it continuously, it was up for 1 hour, they might make a risk call and a judgment call to say, we're fine with that. We're fine with that risk and that exposure. But if it was up for 2 days before it got pulled down, actually, no, we need to go rotate these credentials and we need to deal with that. So it depends on the bug, and we make a judgment call submitting it, I guess. But, from a company perspective, having that insight allows you to make more informed judgment calls. So we've never had any issues. But again, that's just our experience, right? I don't know. And in terms of, are we concerned about, other people scanning stuff and finding these sorts of bugs? People do. Right, and people will, and they won't submit them. They won't tell people about it, and they will exploit it. That's why we have this industry, right? So I honestly don't really think about it too much, but people will do that. Any other questions?
Any more questions?
Yeah.
So when you look for the, I'm trying to figure out. So like, when you start monitoring things, how often do you find surprise new assets where you're like, oh, they didn't tell me about this, and there's a surprise now?
Yeah, so it really depends on the company, right? Some companies, even if they have a large attack surface, they're still, you're only sort of seeing 5 new assets a week, right? Other companies, you're seeing 30, 40 new assets a week. But that also doesn't account for changed assets as well. That's the other side of the monitoring, right? As you saw in some of these examples, there are these assets that have been out there for a long time. They're not new, but they're changed, right? So yeah, I mean, we see it all the time. We do track this sort of stuff when we're using this for bounties, right? We just get a Slack notification, and it's here's something new, and if it looks interesting, we can deal with it. But it depends on the company. It really depends. But generally speaking, for larger companies that have a large team of developers, it's anywhere between sort of 5 and 30 new assets a week. And it's not necessarily constant, but it goes up and down. But yeah.
Can I add? How many of those, when you tell the company, they're like, "What's that?"
Oh yeah, all the time. And we've. This is more related to a demo, right? But we were demoing to one of our customers, and we found some bugs related to PHP apps. And the response was, I didn't know we used PHP anywhere in our environment. And I was literally showing them the website with PHP debug bar on it, right? So that's common. And it's not. And when I say that, and we can joke, right? It's not an indictment on that company or those people, because it is hard. It is really hard to manage this sort of stuff, right? And so this is kind of the point of the talk, is to try and how can you take this approach to get some benefit, to try and at least get some visibility into it? Because that's the first part, right? If you don't know you've got PHP on your network, and there's a PHP bug like the most recent one, right? You don't know that you're vulnerable, you don't know how to fix it, you don't know where to fix it, right? So it's always the first step, right?
Cool, thank you.
Cool.
Hey, Michael. Cool
Hey, man.
talk. With all the monitoring that you are doing, there must be a lot of changes that is happening with all the asset. How do you handle all the noises?
So with all the changes that are happening, again, it comes down to impact, right? So, for us, it's really focusing on the security lens, right? So looking at, changes to the assets that are impactful from a security perspective. So looking at, understanding sort of, the application, the JavaScript, the technologies, the ports, and then also looking for specific security focused bugs. So there could be a lot of noise with that, but if you really focus on impact, you can get a high signal, right? So if you're going to, and it depends on what matters to you, right? So when we're looking at it, we're not looking at, are you running SSL v3, right? Is that really that impactful from a real world exploitability perspective versus some of these other things that we've seen, right? Versus, hey, there's a Git repository on the web root. What's in that Git repository, right? So how we really focus on cutting down signal, at least in our cutting down the noise, at least in our approach, is really focusing on impactful issues. And impactful for us is really keeping a bar of exploitability, right? So if this is an exploitable issue, then it's an actionable issue. So that's how we sort of view it. But I mean, everybody has their own sort of different angle. And for different organizations, there might be things that are really important to them that they want to focus on, right? So maybe you're in some sort of regulated kind of industry and they've got certain requirements for things that if you breach that, that's a really big deal. From a security perspective, as we kind of know, security and compliance might not always be aligned, but it is a big deal if you do it. So maybe that's more important. Maybe you look for those issues. But really focusing on what you're looking for to what's important is how you get better signal. Any other questions?
I'm just curious, do you compile or disclose any statistics on your monitoring? So when you do have issues, you kind of have a time frame of when a lot of issues happen?
So in terms of our product that we sell, I really didn't want this to be pitchy, so I hope it doesn't come across as pitchy. We do, right? And that can give you some really interesting insights. So like, if you're continuously monitoring something, then you can see how long does it take to triage, right? And regression. Like, so are you seeing the same issue come up on that asset again? So what's your regression rate? So there is a bunch of statistics that we do put into our portal. From when we submit it and use it for bounties and stuff like that, obviously we don't track that for companies. We do have some interesting stuff that we're just collecting and maybe for another presentation, so we can see like we're looking at all these companies sort of continuously. These are sort of some of the interesting trends, like the knocking off on Friday bugs. You can see that sort of pattern, and it's just an interesting story. So outside of our kind of commercial product, we don't. But there is some interest. That's the other side of it from a remediation perspective as well, and a blue team perspective, is if you are tracking things continuously, you can start to see trends. So like, for example, if you're tracking and looking for certain issues, and maybe you're looking at injection issues, right? And the vast majority of what you're finding are injection issues. They're constantly coming up. So maybe that's insight to say, well, let's train our developers on how to deal with those issues. And then because you're looking at it continuously, what you should see is that number go down over time, right? So you can also, it can help you track that. So yeah, we do as part of our platform, but like not for bounties and stuff, because, we just do it for the fun of finding bugs. So, yeah. Yeah.
Question around, you talk about continuous assurance and just having that more frequent assessment. For enterprises that are doing that, how have you found them dealing with the issue of like scaling the remediation? So
that's a challenge, and it comes back to the sort of the point that I was making before around focusing on impact, right? A lot of, when we talk about pen tests or especially vulnerability assessment, there's a lot of issues that get found that are very noisy, right? So if you were to take like a traditional approach to like a traditional scanner, and somehow magically make it way more efficient and then ramp it up, and you could run it every hour, right? You're just going to get tens of thousands of like SSL issues, tens of thousands of, hey, you're running this patch level, which may or may not be vulnerable to these 20 CVEs that are, oh shit, critical to like, not so much, right? And you just drown in that noise, right? So in terms of focusing on it, we focus on impact, and specifically exploitability. So if you keep that bar of exploitability, so if you can write something, if you're writing this yourself, right, writing your own tooling, focus on, if you're looking for an issue, it has to be some sort of verify the exploitability of that issue. Because in our view, that creates a bar of, it raises the bar and it says, this is actionable in some way. Doesn't always mean that it's critical, right? It doesn't always mean that it's high and that it's immediate, but it's actionable. And so once you focus on that, you start to strip out all the stuff that's not exploitable, thus probably not something you need to deal with. Then you've got the exploitable stuff. And now some of that might be low impact, and the action might be, I fix that in the next patch cycle, right? Or this is really high impact, I need to do it now. But because it's exploitable, you know it's an issue. So that's our approach, at least, and our sort of viewpoint, that exploitability equals actionability. Right, so that's how we focus on it, and so it all comes down to, I guess, the saying, quality, not quantity, right? And if you focus on those important and actionable things, then it becomes a lot more manageable, and you get higher signal. Any other questions? Frenchie, you got a question, mate? You paying attention? So you're looking at your phone.
I wasn't going to do this, but since you called me out, where's Shubs?
Shubs is not here, unfortunately. But I know he's the smart one, but I'm the good-looking one. So we kind of balance each other out, So cool. Any other questions? Oh, cool. All right, thanks, guys.